he's going to introduce himself. So go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, so I'm Ben Sawyer, and I work at Janus Research Group over in the Augusta office, and I'm a software developer, and I'm currently responsible for developing and maintaining the training engine that we use for our simulations.
Hey, I'm Shaun Shepard, also Janus Research Group, and I guess I've been professionally doing simulations in serious games, mainly serious games, with them since 2011, and prior to that, I guess since around 1994, I've been just a hobbyist indie game developer on the side. So that's me.
Go ahead, Taylor.
Hi, I'm Taylor Meyers. I work with Pulseworks. We do motion simulators located in museums. We're not quite as in depth as the Janus Research Group because we appeal to consumers, but different slant on the simulations in serious games and what can be done with physical hardware. So,
I'm Jared Sheets, I'm also part of Janus Research Group. Mostly do serious game efforts. And prior to that, I had worked mostly on like Facebook and mobile games.
And I'm going to be moderating today. My name's Adam Massingale. I have a background in Sims from virtual to live, or a combination of virtual and live Sims as well as constructive Sims. So before we get started, so these guys know the audience that they're talking to, I kind of want to get some general. I'm going to throw out some feeler questions for you guys and just raise your hand if it applies to you. So who here is an engineer? All right, a lot of engineers, good. So who would consider themselves to be more design oriented? Maybe 1, 2 people, maybe 10. So more art influenced. Who does more art influenced work? Everybody, good. Guess that's awesome. Excellent. We'll talk to art. So we'll talk to a little bit of art, but we'll stay light on the art. So who's newer in the industry? Maybe less experienced. Maybe new to Sims, or maybe you're here to learn about Sims specifically. Okay, cool. And who's maybe had a few years or a ton of years in the industry? Who's like an active industry? But okay, awesome. So there you go, guys. Now you know who you're talking to.
wait, was I supposed to raise my hand for that?
Okay, so there's several types of Sims, and there's different aspects of Sims, and we definitely, some of you guys in the industry, as well as definitely you panelists, know that we incur a ton of different technical problems. Some shared in games for entertainment, and some that are things that entertainment games you're not going to see as much. So we're going to try to talk to some of those points. And we're going to get started maybe with some general questions here. So the first question that I have for you guys is I want to talk about the tools that we use to develop Sims. What, in your experience, is a good tool? What do you maybe use at work? And what are your successes and failures with that tool? Why do you like it? And that sort of thing. So whoever wants to pick it up, maybe Shaun, you want to pick it up?
Yeah, all right, so I work on a more of a framework, core technology software engineer, and the tools are a vital part of what we provide our users, which are the people who actually develop serious game content and the simulations. So it's a delicate thing. You have to spend a lot of time up front making some solid decisions on where do you want to put your money and time in terms of tools, and what can you bring to the table above what existing tool sets are going to provide, because you got to consider when you hire someone, if you can hire from a pool of people that are familiar with a tool that's existing out in the community already, that's a consideration moving forward. But so you have to kind of decide what makes sense to develop in-house and out-of-house, and what we've kind of worked through the years at. We spent several years, teams of varying sizes, maybe up to 6, 7 people, developing tool sets and technology in-house, and we came to a point where, we use Unity 3D as one of our main engines that we utilize. And as you guys, if you may or may not realize, but Unity community is extremely big. It's a very popular and capable tool set. There's things that we have to do in the training that we provide in simulations is very specific to the client's needs, and in order to develop it, you need additional frameworks and tools to create the content that it's just not available within Unity. So I guess we tried to focus our efforts on tools that helped technical content creators generate.
So I just want to, I'm gonna ask you, so one thing that you brought up that I thought was interesting that I know that I've came across, and it's like the biggest double-edged sword ever, is developing those frameworks, developing your tools versus maybe utilizing someone else's tool. So what I mean is like maybe you want to write your own animation system, or maybe you want to go buy someone's animation system. Up front, the cost is going to be much more to purchase that, but maybe it comes with support and that sort of thing. But you might end up encountering a problem like you can't extend it down the road, or maybe that company goes out of business, right? And you've like built your entire, all your frameworks around this one piece of software. So, I mean, is that something that you guys have encountered?
Yeah, well, Pulseworks, we use Unity, so I definitely agree, because there's, if you're going to do simulations, I probably wouldn't recommend that. Like I said, we deal more with consumers, so we're like halfway between serious and entertainment games. But we actually created a prototype for a game that was made by, we had a game made by somebody else, and we worked on our own version of it to replace it. And we got a asset off of the asset store for the physics simulations of planes, but it wasn't entirely meant for the Mach speed planes that we have, so we're limited by it unless we want to go in there and try and rip out all the code and figure out what's going on. Otherwise, now we have there's a set cap on it right now where if you start going a certain speed, the plane just starts shaking uncontrollably. So.
Okay.
That's kind of the problems with using tools built by other people. I mean, it's got limitations.
But it's the thing that I guess you kind of have to be willing to take a chance sometimes. And
even speaking, and especially with the Unity Asset Store, the thing was like $100.
Right. Which the cost of development is extremely large.
Exactly.
If you're going to create a quality tool, it's not something to be taken lightly, and it's a pretty lengthy endeavor that you need to. I'd say that I guess it depends on your decision makers and what their priorities are. But I'd say that if you're in a position to help someone make a decision, that if you feel a certain way about a tool set that you've used and you feel like would add value, I'd say if you get any pushback, try to estimate out the cost to develop an internal tool and what the benefits are. But we've gone down both paths on teams that I've worked on, and currently we're taking a look at moving away from some of the custom stuff and moving towards what other people have developed in terms of tool sets and libraries and things.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, right now I think both of you are kind of speaking to physics simulations.
Not necessarily.
Okay. I just want to get like temperature gauge of like what kind of things are you simulating? Like, is it physics? Is it behaviors? Is it weather patterns? Like what? And maybe we talk about that.
So a lot of the stuff that I know that most of the folks here, aside from Taylor, a lot of the sims are more are training for military personnel. So human trainers, like not necessarily combat trainers, but how to do a job effectively. Perhaps so one of the big efforts that we experienced at Janus was a biometric and forensic simulator. How does that roll in the Army? How do you go and do that job? How do you go and what happens when you land on a site? How do you process evidence, that sort of stuff? Ben,
I think Ben's got some, because serious games, and Ben, you also have done some interactive multimedia instruction. So talk about that.
So I'm on Janus's IMI side, it's interactive multimedia instruction, and it's more kind of more of a linear classroom type setting. where they have lessons that they have to go through, and they're learning about how to operate certain pieces of equipment. So a lot of the simulations that are in our product, it's mostly dealing with modeling real-world equipment, and so you have a router, you have to model where all the buttons do, what all the switches do, the LEDs, and you create these training scenarios, basically interactive 3D instruction manuals that they go through, and they're graded on their performance and learning how to operate from a single piece of equipment to an entire vehicle. And we also use Unity 3D on our products as well, and it's been really convenient because it's a lot of crossover. It works really well for us, and so we develop the actual training engine itself, and then we give our users are actually the writers who take our engine and they write the lessons, and the artists plug in their assets to it, and they develop these courses, these training courses for students. I don't know if we've used a whole lot from the asset store, but I think I would say it's probably something that we're
trending in that direction.
Yeah.
Just because it's
there's been sort of a history of like non-invented here syndrome. Like everybody wants to make their own thing.
You want to have your IP, and there's some reasons behind some of that as well, because we work with the federal government. Sometimes you have constraints that you have to develop certain solutions in-house. But one of the things I wanted to talk about real quick about the IMI stuff, the interactive multimedia instruction, it's a lot more cost effective for people to train within a virtual environment rather than to have to deploy out and get the physical equipment. But one of the really neat things, you were talking about a router, is one of the things that you basically apply, you say, here's what we're modeling, and you apply the rule set. The training developers say, here are the rules for the system. When I plug this, it has this effect. When I do this knob, 10 degrees or whatever. You program all the logic and the rules. And one of the things that I found in the training rooms is that people discover new things about the hardware that the trainers didn't even necessarily intend. And I think the keynote yesterday that Warren was talking about is that's what you're kind of striving for within entertainment games as well, but it applies in our space in simulations, is that the users uncovered a new way to solve a problem with this specific router configuration that the real world people hadn't actually thought of. And that's very neat, because of the rules.
Yeah, and there was no risk of damaging real world
You're not
equipment
going
by
to
messing around
ruin anything by experimenting.
So we've talked a little bit about tools. Before I change gears, I want to know if you guys have any questions specific to tools or your own tools, writing your own tools, or maybe a specific tool that you're considering evaluating that maybe somebody up here might have used. Everybody, you?
Well, I mean, I was just going to say, like, for me, it's mostly the math libraries.
Okay.
Because most of my stuff isn't like real world simulation. It's more actual like gameplay simulation, like the Sims, things like that.
Right.
And having really good math libraries. I mean, if you're doing C++, I mean, most of the Boost math libraries are right there for you. If you're going into Unity, MathF covers probably a lot of it. There's a couple of, I don't know how many guys here like math. I love math.
Yeah.
They're willing to admit it openly.
It's really, there's some fantastic functions. Good stuff. ATAN too.
Yes.
I hate circles. But yeah.
So why not? So as far as math libraries, are you talking more specific to Unity, like some that you could use in Unity outside of MathF, or?
So there's when you get into there's a couple of libraries there. I don't think they're in the asset store. It's just open source on GitHub that you can pull down. There's a really great extension to MathF. I think it's called MathF 2. Very creative, and it put in a whole bunch of additional trick shortcuts. So as you're trying to do a simulation of a turret that's got multiple moving parts, so as you've got your screen, especially in like a touch interface where you're translating from an XY chord of a touch position, you're guessing the Z depth because you can't get that from a touch. So you're saying like maybe 400 on Z. Anyway, the point is you can get a good world space to local space rotation, and then to try to get the pitch as well to where you're going. So some nice, I think it's MathF 2 is a good one.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, definitely.
Personally, I've just used, either had to write my own or just make use of the matrix vector math and MathF that's available. I haven't particularly used a library like that, so.
I'm very lazy.
Hey, well, I think
You're very cost effective. I
Right,
mean,
right.
writing a lot of that math from scratch is, it's a big time sink.
error prone.
And it's error prone. I mean,
Well,
not
and
that
I mean,
other
for people that don't know about it, MathF can be the good book. It can be all they know. So it's
Yeah.
like, how can I do a complex, multitude of sine waves and atans and like all that
Yeah.
stuff? It's like somebody's already done it, so it's a
That's
good
one of the
resource.
things you run into when you start solving specific problems is if you find those tricks, those shortcuts with math, and you won't find a lot of those in general libraries because you
Yeah.
found them, they're really fast,
Yeah.
they're really efficient. And of course, you wrote them yourself that, you've gone through the debugging process. But one of the things you get on top of that is you get that understanding in your head of that math, that specific type of problem, and you can take that to other problems that are similar to that. So it comes in handy that way.
Yeah.
If you guys could all use like GitHub's snippet system, like whenever you come up with a really clever function to solve a very specific thing, and just
Yeah.
put a snippet up on
Yeah.
GitHub so that we can all find it, I would just really appreciate it.
Code sharing.
Yeah, those math libraries can be like a double-edged sword, though. In the past, I worked on some, in the fully immersive sim space, working with like inertial motion capture suits. A lot of the sensor libraries and stuff use this, quaternion math, and I'm very unqualified to do quaternion math. I mean, but when you got to do your job, you got to get in there and you got to learn as you go along.
You got gimbal locked, didn't you?
No, I mean, this is, so,
That's a con.
funny story, I mean, like, just specific to talking about libraries, it was a library that we were using from this sort of up-and-comer kind of company. This was back when they had, like, the Army was R&D in a lot of these suits, and the library had, like, errors in it. Like, we assumed that, these people, when they delivered this, piece of equipment, it would work fine and that sort of thing. But sometimes you have to get in there and you have to debug that code, and it can be a wreck. So,
Even the tool, like I said, with the tool I got for the plane physics, it can't go over a certain speed. And when I first got to Pulseworks, they had a 3D pathfinding solution for underwater fish, but using it, and then we needed to advance it, and I discovered that it had no queuing system. Like, the things would just make requests, and it would go, if the thing was busy, it would just go, okay, you just stay in this while loop for however long, and then once it wasn't busy, the first one that got to it was the one that got to run its path next. So
yeah.
that was
Say
fun.
when you're deciding if
Yeah.
you want to do like an in-house tool or use an existing one, you gotta look at like how much time you're willing to devote to that tool. If there's a solution out there that doesn't meet your requirements exactly, and if those tools don't meet those requirements, like how much is that going to affect you?
Yeah.
And how much time and manpower can you throw at creating your own in-house tools? Because something that we learned was the first iteration of your tool is never going to hit the mark how you wanted it to.
Definitely not.
So what's going to happen is you're going to develop a tool, and you either pass it off to like your sim team, or maybe you're the guy who's using your tool, and then you're like, oh, I didn't think about this. So then you go back and you work more on the tool, and you invest a lot of time into it, and it can be completely worth it. But there's some projects that I've been on where very short timeline, we didn't have really the option to create our own in-house tools because of the very short timeline. So it was one of those instances where we had to go find an existing product or an existing tool, look at it, learn the downsides or what it wasn't capable of doing, and just working around those. And we ran into some very like huge red flags towards the end of the project, but it was one of those like
You have to work through it.
you have to work through it. Yeah.
I guess maybe one last thing about that is, if you are going to purchase a tool, I basically would demand that you get the source code as well.
Yes, definitely.
And good support.
And good support.
Have like
I know we're spending a lot of time on it, guys, but honest to God, I mean, this has been a huge problem for us. I mean, so I think it's really important to talk about. But I do want to switch gears. I want to talk about what I consider, we are talking about how to make awesome sims, and I consider this to be the $1 million question. And hopefully you guys can shed some insight, and maybe we can get some good participation.
Two-sentence answer coming.
So So the $1 million question, in my opinion, is how do you design? I mean, I'm sure some sims are boring. The material is boring. Maybe not the sim's boring. The material's boring. Like a router, there's only so many ways you can spin that. And sims don't have to be fun and engaging, but a lot of times you have a lot of tools in front of you where you can create a very engaging experience that'll amplify your training and I think either immerse or engage the player more. How do you do that with the really dry stuff? I mean, have you ever tried to solve that problem, or are you just like, it's just going to be boring? Or, I mean, have you ever came across it and said, this is how, or maybe your designer said, look, this is how we're going to try to do it?
I guess I'll start with a quick one. Is one of our customers, we've developed multiple serious games for them, and we're taking a look back at what we provided and compared some of the stuff. So earlier on in our tool development process and our serious game efforts, we didn't put in more gamey type elements. Like the user interface wasn't what you would, it was just very dry, like you were saying.
It didn't have to be engaging, but you got your material in there, right?
Right, absolutely. Okay, yeah, that's what I'm getting to, is that, obviously it doesn't have to be. And in a lot of cases in simulations, the people that you're developing it for, they kind of need us, as the developers of the simulation, to show them the value of increasing and gamifying it, basically. And adding these more engaging and immersive elements. But so they looked at two of the products, and they said, we like the content of product A, and game B, we like the look and feel. And the difference was we had a lot more game type elements and look and feel that you would expect in a AAA console title of some sort. The achievement system, the notification system, and the interactions were, but they appreciate the content. But I guess what I would say is one of the ways that you would do it is to think about the elements that work in games for entertainment and apply them as you can, because the client might not necessarily understand that that's what they want or that's going to be effective, but once they have seen two to compare,
right,
they understood the value quickly of adding those types of.
And to shed some insight on the differences, I'll just elaborate to give you guys a working example of one of those differences in between those two different sims. There was a couple of similarities in the sim. Sim 1, say the more boring way to train somebody on a piece of material might be an image and some text followed with some instruction and maybe an activity on how to take a fingerprint. Versus a game mechanic where somebody went in and said, we're actually going to have the player interact, walk up, do the procedure on an NPC and that sort of thing, or maybe use some sort of UI and guide them through the steps to do it. So a much more engaging experience, and that was one of the things I think that worked out, in the positive.
Right, and one more specific feature, and when I said the notification, so two more. The notification system was to keep the user informed of to guide them what was next in the process if they forgot, just to have a nice little dialogue box section that stacked up, and they could see where they needed to go or who they needed to talk to or what maybe the next step was in this training. And then another one is an interactive carousel of items or options of how you can interact with things, like a carousel type of menu that displayed out in front of as you clicked on an item to interact with it. They liked that better than, I'm trying to remember how the old school style was, but it was just a bit more clunky and simple, I guess. But they appreciated the more interactive and look and feel to the carousel.
So, kind of on the subject of look and feel and stuff, do you guys find that in your sims, your virtual, because I know everybody here works in the virtual space, those type of sims, do graphics matter? Do you guys get a lot of feedback on graphics from an end user, or maybe even we'll say the customer first, and then if you've had any direct access to the end user, them as well?
I think it definitely matters for the simulations that we do because, like I said, we're trying to recreate real world equipment. Like it's not a fantasy environment. It's not cartoony. Like it's real world stuff. And when you get to talking about things like labels on a piece of equipment, hazard warnings and fault lights and that sort of thing, they need to be realistic because these are soldiers. They're going to be in the field, and it's mission critical information that they have to understand. So, I think from a training perspective, there is definitely a lot of benefit to making the objects in the environment as realistic as possible. Now, that could be shaders to make pieces of metal more shiny, or it could be just better textures for, like I said, labels and just things to be a little bit more immersive. I guess that probably would hold a student's attention more, and they can focus on the lesson because things aren't, popping out like catching their eye is looking really weird or uncanny and that sort of thing.
What about you? What do you think? Have you ever got any feedback from maybe a customer or an end user that said, "Man, these graphics just could be better," or
Yeah, I don't hear most of that stuff, luckily.
Okay.
So, not that it doesn't exist, but I think especially what you're talking about, like the uncanniness of it, is especially when you're striving for those look. If you're gonna try and make it look right, it needs to look right, because, speaking on the dry material, I have the pleasure of doing air combat and underwater dinosaurs, but when the giant Leopleurodon is swimming through the water, if he looks like he's just belly flopping through the water, then people point that out, and they can't focus on anything else.
Basically, I think there's a certain threshold you have to meet.
Yeah.
Like there's a minimum, like there can't be oddities that exist, and there has to be a certain level of realism, but above that, I think it becomes a nice to have. Like having the latest graphics and like fantastic looking textures and real-time lighting, I think are all nice to haves that can add immersion, but like Ben was saying, things have to be clear. If they try to read something that's important, it needs to be extremely easy to do so.
We've had our hands tied in the past a lot because our end users, Army students in classroom settings on government computers running Pentiums in Windows XP in 2009.
This isn't made up, by the way.
We have to,
He's telling the truth.
More recently, we've had more freedom, but in the past, we've had to really, had a lot of restrictions with, performance and having to really target, not the machines that we're using to develop on, but really, really old machines. So.
Okay.
I'd say that Unity it offers a lot of tweaks and settings that you can make. I'd say Unity is pretty good at that, and we've taken advantage of that as much as we can, and multi-platform support and everything.
And even if you're doing a commercial sim at that point, then like if maybe it's not being released to a customer on a specific machine setup, you still got to keep in mind your lowest end users and make sure that like your shaders are supported. You don't have purple things running around in your world.
Purple and pink, that's awesome.
And we've started taking some of our older products and now trying to make them run on mobile devices, and that's been a real challenge for us because that's kind of our first foray into mobile, was taking these products that were developed several years ago and with no assumptions being made that this needs to run on mobile, and now suddenly it needs to run on mobile. We're finding all these holes and these edge cases where we use this shader and it's not supported, and we don't,
Right. Yeah, definitely. So I want to kind of step back a little bit. We talked a lot about these graphics, and somebody started mentioning, getting on the topic of the material, the actual material. So it seemed like, sometimes you do have to sacrifice graphics, but they do have to meet a certain requirement, but it's really more about that material you're presenting. In your experience, how do you guys maintain that? Or is there somebody that you work with, perhaps an expert, like on your material that you're developing? Is there somebody that comes in that makes sure that it's right, along the way, that you're not straying too far from what you're trying to achieve?
Absolutely, there's some people that are engaged. It's part of the Agile methodology, if you will, is to engage early and often and and get that feedback constantly throughout the development cycle.
Right.
So, we are constantly receiving feedback about the material that we're developing, and if it's meeting the mark in terms of what they know the customer is
Right.
going to demand, or even just what we need to deliver because we understand the simulation space, maybe even better than our
Right.
clients.
So, so one thing I'm gonna say is, in my experience working at Janus in the past, we have a couple of levels of people to make sure that our trainers, are close, of high quality, I guess. So we have like what we call training facilitators. We have subject matter experts, and we have
Training
ISDs, people that really hammer down. I mean, a lot of times they'll bring a lot of our ambitions back on how to do, how crazy we want to go, how cool we want to make a feature, because they're like, it just has to, that's cool, but it's not accomplishing what it needs to accomplish. Derek, why don't you speak to some of that? I know you've had some firsthand experience on those subject matter experts and interacting with them. Can you identify any struggles and stuff, and like how do you work with them and still meet the end goal and deliver something that's great?
So we typically have like 1 to 2 subject matter experts on the team, and we usually try to loop them in and show them the latest build 2 to 4 times a month. So usually weekly, but at the worst case scenario, bi-weekly. And that, I would say, is pretty necessary if you have someone on the team who knows the material that you're trying to teach users, because they need to see like every week, like, hey, these are the new things we added, maybe. And for like a developer, it's one of those things where you're like, oh, it doesn't matter, it's just in the game, like, there are these items laying out on the table, and then you'll show it to a subject matter expert and they'll say, well, that item would not be on that table, or like that object is not a part of that kit that like soldiers carry around with them. And that's actually a big issue, because you're kind of subconsciously teaching the users that like, hey, that item should be a part of that kit where it really shouldn't. And like I said, developers, that sounds super trivial, but it's actually very important for the end product. As far as difficulties, I would say, at least in my experience, the subject matter experts we've worked with are usually more in favor of dry experiences. Maybe they just haven't used simulations a lot themselves, or aren't familiar with games in general when we're making a serious game, so they more prefer like a very dry implementation and say like, hey, yeah, just show some images and like play some audio and talk about how this stuff's supposed to work. And then we have to kind of work with them and say, that's the information you want to get across. Let's think of a far more engaging way that relays that information very clearly, but is a lot more interesting to an end user. So
Okay.
I'd say for most people, it's going to be the game designer, like, because you guys are like really serious with like military hardware. People will die, turn the router off wrong and it'll blow up or whatever. But I think for like game designer, game developers probably is going to be like, I have the worst subject matter expert in the world.
Is it yourself?
Will Wright.
Oh God.
I'll say one game we had that was a little less meant to be like very serious was we were going to teach just like the average user in a corporation like some important lessons about security and like how to keep your personal computer, your work computer, protected from threats. And to a subject matter expert, and they gave us all kinds of acronyms, all kinds of security agencies, and our first pass at the game or the simulation was this extremely like word heavy. It had a scenario and it had a story, but there was just a ton of information that got thrown at users, and I seriously doubt they were able to retain it. So we looked internally and was like, this doesn't seem like a good way to do this. Let's completely backtrack. Let's keep all this information on hand. This still needs to be presented in a way, but we've got to do a much better job of relaying this information. So what we turned around and made instead was a game where you're kind of looking at a virtual desktop, and you're able to look through like the person's emails, what programs they have installed, like correspondence with their users, like things like that. And then you had to look through and like kind of look through their emails and be like, hey, there's an exe attached to this. That's probably not safe. this guy's asking for their like VPN password. You shouldn't send that, over the internet. And like, it's things that most people, like as people who use computers every day, are like, wow, that's really stupid. But these occurrences happen like far too often in like everyday corporations. So when we developed that second type of product, it was a lot more not so in your face, not a lot of text. Like you looked through the emails and then you had to flag which items on the computer. You'd be like, yeah, that's a problem. And then like this, they have maybe some like game installed on their work computer that goes online. Probably, not, and they had to go through and like flag all these different, made it much more of a game. But at the end of the day, that product was a lot more efficient at making people realize like, hey, shouldn't send my coworkers my password, shouldn't like open exes on my emails, like just things like that.
Yeah, I'm gonna step back to when you were talking about, when I asked if you were your own subject matter expert, that wasn't taking a knock. I've been in a situation where that duty has fallen on me, where I've had to go out and research, and I'm kind of like solely responsible for like the research and then development of a product, and it can become. And even like the testing, depending on your situation, maybe some of you guys have been in that, in a crunch or in a small team setting where you have to wear those multiple hats. Have you guys ever been in, or maybe in your current job, do you have to wear those multiple hats? How do you make sure, I guess, you don't sacrifice like training material, or, we all know that it's dangerous to like test your own code and that sort of stuff. So how do you, if you're in that environment, or if you've been in that environment, what have you done to kind of alleviate some of those problems?
I can't say that I haven't experienced that in the simulation space. Luckily, it's people have their responsibility, and you stay in your lane, and you communicate obviously cross-functionally, but try to stay away from stacking too much on a single individual or a single team.
So
you'd spread those responsibilities, and I think it's an important part of the success.
It's probably critical, and as far as like in the sim space, to definitely spread those out and make sure you're not in that situation, because it sounds like what you're saying is it'll probably definitely compromise the quality of the training.
Right. I would imagine that if you could avoid it, you may not be able to, depending on your financial situation, but if you can spread the responsibility, it's quite effective.
Okay. All right.
Can I derail you for just a moment?
Absolutely.
I love this training stuff. This is amazing. It's not my field, so it's great hearing about all of it. But like in your training, do you have to do like any like enemy AI or anything like that, where you have to simulate like
certainly.
a jihadist who's going to destroy you? Or that's a terrible thing for me to say. I'm sorry, but like have an enemy who's going to kill you. Like if you could speak to that maybe a little bit of like getting into like AI simulations or like enemy simulations.
Yeah, absolutely. So as far as AI goes, we've gone down a few paths. Obviously, I guess people say pathfinding is AI, but we're not going to go there. I mean, pathfinding has been solved, and we use a solution that helps solve that for us. But as far we've done behavior trees, implemented behavior trees to that worked out fairly well for the most part. If you're familiar with behavior trees, it's a common kind of design pattern, if you will, to represent how an AI should make its decisions. We're actually seeing that we're moving towards finite state machines, or somewhat fuzzy state machines actually. But are you looking for like some of the stuff that we've actually implemented, like in particular jihadist scenarios or something?
Well, no, are you like, so you bring up behavior trees and like finite state machines, like, so with your experience, which one do you prefer? Like, which one have you had more success with trying to get, because you guys are trying to do like an exact thing, this guy's going to bring whatever to here.
Right, a lot of the stuff that we deal with is more scripted than just wide open. There's not a lot of depth to the AI that we implement, because they have very specific things that they're looking for that happen at semi-specific times. We randomize some of it, but I'd say as far as comparing behavior trees and finite state machines, I think there's more to consider than just those two implementations. I'd say I lean more towards finite state machines, But it's not just because of AI. It's because of other concepts within the system that you can represent in a state machine that you just can't represent in a behavior tree. And it's a consistent thing that if you lean on a state machine framework for more than one thing, that it helps the development of the simulation because people are familiar with it in more than one area. But I'd say things like conversations can be scripted, and the branching can be represented within a state machine as well. I'd say that things like quests or scripted actions can also be represented there, as well as you can actually represent a behavior tree. We've done it in state machines. It's not exactly a one-to-one match, but you can come up with something that's actually pretty similar. So since you can accomplish the same thing essentially, and you can do more and integrate that flow, like I can control someone's AI and also write about his conversations all in one tool set in one finite state machine domain, and not have to kind of switch between tools and mindsets and think about where the data is flowing into other systems. It's all within one, and you can write a tool set that helps you debug, and now you don't have to have 3 tool sets, one for conversations, one for quests, one for AI. It could all be one, and that's why I would say I'd prefer state machines in that sense. But at the same time, I don't know if you guys, there's some performance concerns that you need to think about as well. It's like how heavy you utilize state machines. But you can do some neat things with state machines. You can have them activation based, which allows you to say, I've got this set of states that can be active at any given time. I'm not going to tell you that you can only be in this state, and here's how you transition from state A to state B. Here's the conditions. You can just say, under what circumstances will this particular state be active? So you can have probability-based things like that to have more than one state active at a time, and you don't necessarily have to write the transitions from each of those states to each of the other states. It's just, when am I active, when am I not active, and what level of activation. You can do some really neat things with activation-based state machines. It's pretty an interesting thing to check out, actually. Anybody else?
I want to ask about your Leo Pleurodon.
Yes.
Are you simulating buoyancy? And like, what are you doing for water? Like,
Yeah, we're not doing it that simulated, I guess, which is great to say in a simulation panel, but we're just using general force to push him up and down in a sine wave manner.
so you make decisions?
Yeah, very simple ones right now, like whether just to attack. We actually, because dealing with the AI, our solution for it is because we do deal with the consumer side that we want them to see. We don't care so much about the Leo Pleurodon living on his own. We want the player to see the Leo Pleurodon living on his own. So normally if he's off screen, he's just doing nothing, and then when he's on screen, we try and get him to participate in an event of going after a smaller creature, killing a plesiosaur, or doing that. Or similarly, like with the air combat one, we have, you could program a perfect AI to hunt down a player, but that's not necessarily the point of it. The point is for the player to learn how to hunt him down and evade him. So you have to kind of have those built in. If you're using a state machine, then you can attack for this long, and then you're exhausted or whatever, and then you're fleeing now, and then the player has a chance to kill them, even though, in real life, would that really happen, I guess. But I do consumer sides. And
Yeah. We, so back,
you had a question?
Oh, go ahead.
It's a bit of a deviation, but like in terms of requirements, I was kind of wondering if you guys had any advice about ways that you've gone about defining requirements and defining them, considering that at times you have like a person to talk to who's an expert in addition to requirements that slate on you about what needs to be in the simulation. Just curious if you had any.
Well, I'm probably in the unique position amongst this group to completely despise those requirements. As I said, we market, Janus does it for the training, we're doing it for the dollar bills, y'all.
Oh, believe me, so are we.
Yeah, that's kind of related to like the dry material in a way, isn't it? making, the requirements are the things drying up the material.
Yeah.
But,
Very true.
Yeah, like your requirements are typically like what, at least for us, what ideas and what lessons do we need to tell to the player, and then from that you have to come up with, now how do we present that in a way that people actually want to go through the simulation and be like, oh wow, yeah, that was engaging, like I'd like to continue like playing this or using this, and in addition like actually learning more. But I guess in some cases, if it's meant as a training simulation, then yes, that's like the number one priority, is like teach them things, whatever those things are. But it has to be done in a way, I think, that like they're staying engaged, because if it's so off-putting that they're just kind of going through the motions, especially if it's a text-heavy simulation, a lot of that's probably going to be lost on them. It'll kind of go in one ear and out the other.
I was going to say, just on the subject of requirements, is it's highly recommended to have a way to capture metrics on how effective your training is and how you're meeting the requirements that they put forth. Because oftentimes for simulation, the requirement is that, or for training actually, is that they've learned the material. So you need to be able to measure that and work with whoever's defining the requirements. What do we need to measure? How do we know what success is? And then you need to capture that and be able to present it to them. And within, there's several kind of standards within the simulation world. There's SCORM, which I'm not that familiar with, but I know, Ben, you're probably a lot more familiar with than I am. But they've got learning management systems, and the Army's got checks on learning and things like that, that I would say are very applicable in other spaces as well, to capture that so that it's provable how well you're meeting the requirements.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I was going to say something about the requirements. We deal with a lot of military contracts where I work. The thing that we always do with requirements is we'll usually get some document that's extremely vague, and it usually takes a few iterations, but first run we'll go through and we'll kind of look up the devices that they want to simulate, or the weapons that they do, and then we'll make our own requirements of what we translate their product requirements to be, and then send that back to them. Say, okay, is this exactly what you want? And they'll usually say, well, you have this wrong and this wrong, and that kind of gets like drilled down into, okay, now we know what you actually need.
So is that the common way? Is it usually sending back and forth as opposed to sitting down with experts from both sides and like taking a time to hash it out?
At least from what I do, we deal with people that usually are a lot more important than we are.
So not enough time to do that.
So yeah, I mean, it's normally like we'll send it back to them, and we might hear back within the next month.
Yeah. It's also something that if you can, in terms of gathering requirements and refining them, that you work with your clients and the people that are providing them to help them understand that it's an iterative process, that we don't need to iron this out on day one or week one or whatever, all up front at one time, bang, here it is, go off, come back a year from now and give us a product. It's, okay, we can start with a couple of sentences now, and like you were saying, is that we take it off our team of business analysts, can flesh that out, because we've got a lot of in-house military experience, so our people understand that as well. So we flesh it out, go back, and it's an iterative thing that we can develop certain amount of it as we go, and it, you refine and define the requirements in an ongoing fashion.
Well, I think the important thing to remember with the requirements too, constantly, because if you're dealing with an expert in that field, you're an expert in your field, he's an expert in their field, but there's a breakdown between it, because they're not an expert in your field. They don't know what all the technical jargon and stuff like that is.
Can't you just make it
So-
work, Taylor?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not
No,
that
I
hard.
can't.
It's what's it going to take like 4
So I mean, I think that's just the mindset you need to be in, of they're great at knowing the military or whatever subject they are, blood cells, and they want to simulate it, and you're great at simulating things. but you need to make sure that each of you is, that's why the iterative and the refining and, you know, like those examples help, is because you can go, okay, here's our stuff, here's what we're interpreting this as, and then they go, okay, that makes a little more sense to me, and now they come back and, because like with us, with speaking with museums, you know, they're like, oh, we want to have a, you know, a dinosaur game or whatever, and it needs to be all this scientifically accurate, and it's like, okay, well, we can't do that, but we can do this, you know, so.
I think it's important too to, I know we've touched on this before, but like weekly or bi-weekly reviews with the client, because sometimes, because of the differences in your expertise, like them being expertise on a certain subject, you being more an expertise in like just developing a simulation or a game, sometimes how you word a phrase or how they word a phrase might get lost in translation, and then you develop something a little outside of what they thought, and you may not realize that there was that misunderstanding until you actually develop it and show it to them, and they might say, that was close to what we wanted, but you're not exactly hitting the mark. Like, let's talk about how we can change this and make it work better. And if you're doing like 2 or 3 month reviews, you're gonna get a pile of that stuff all at once, and you're probably gonna have to make major changes to the game. Whereas if you're doing it 2 to 4 times a month, they're gonna be like more smaller, much more manageable. You know, you haven't gotten very far in developing this feature, you're kind of showing them a first pass, and then you're making smaller adjustments, and you're staying more on track that way.
So you think Agile is especially important for Sims?
I would say so, because it seems like more often than not when someone's coming to you asking for a simulation, they know the subject matter, but they're not necessarily very familiar with how to do it in the simulation well. And so, and you may not know how to best present that subject matter either. So it's kind of a guided or a codependent, exploratory. Like you kind of say, well, here's our first idea, like here's how we think we would do it, and then they can agree on that. You do it a week or two and show them your results, and you might be pretty on spot and you only have to make minor adjustments, but you also could be pretty far off the mark. And if that's the case, you want to know that early. You want to know that very often, rather than meeting 4 or 5 times a year.
It's a struggle, man. I would say, to add what you're talking about, when you're interfacing with these customers, I think it's good to have somebody that's really good at understanding a customer or a subject matter expert, because sometimes you as a developer, I mean, it's like talking to artists. I mean, I don't know what language those guys speak either, but, you know, I have a producer that does a really good job of relaying, you know, information from me to that person to me. So sometimes, like, you have, we put people, like some of our project managers fill that role, or sometimes a producer might fill that role, or sometimes whoever, because it's tough to talk to people that don't know your wheelhouse. And, you know, a lot of the times we're not experts on, you know, radio frequencies or any sort of, you know, crazy whatever, you know, insert X training material that's going to go in this sim. So I'd say to help your process or your team, that I think that's a really nice role to have. I've been in teams where that didn't exist, and teams where it does, and I think it works really well. We're running short on time, guys. I'd love to get some more questions in. Anybody have any more questions?
I have a question.
Sure.
I guess getting back to tools, I was wondering what everybody or what other people use for networking libraries. Does anybody use the new UNet stuff or Unity?
Okay, so we've never, well, personally myself, and I'm not sure anybody else on the team has for the Sims that we do. We haven't used Unity networking, although it's based on Racknet, and I think that it's something that needs to be considered because they've solved a lot of the problems, and it's a very solid framework. However, in the past we've used Photon, if you're familiar with that, and then we
Rolled out.
I wrote a networking library just based off of C# socket API, UDP, TCP, and some inter-process communication. It's a very similar API to the TCP sockets. But outside of that, that's what we've used.
Yeah.
I'd say that we really should, I think looking at using Racknet implementation that Unity provides out of the box is a pretty good way to go, because they've got how to synchronize data and automatically send it across the network, and it's a really solid, easy.
Make it easy on you. If it's your need, I mean,
Right.
like I think it's their solution, and it might have changed because I'm not well versed on their updated networking, but I know.
I can speak to it directly.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I actually wrote the implementation. So it's called UNet, is what they're branding it as
UNet,
now.
okay, all right.
And it was Racknet,
Right.
and I actually was on the team to integrate it.
Awesome, dude.
Oh.
Fill us in. Fill
Oh, yeah, so I can speak to it kind of directly. So Unet's pretty good. It's still early beta, right? So it's there's problems with it, but the problems are in the edge and corner case spaces. If you're just trying to do just normal message passing and normal communication, it's fine. They've built in a lot of tool sets to try to. They've been trying to. It's funny. There was a implementation that I wrote as well that they didn't take from me, but man, it looks a lot similar. So the short, not to get bogged down too much here, but they've switched everything to an authoritative server now. So if you're going to run, so you can run standalone servers now, or what they call a host, which is a client and a server on the same machine. But you have the top level class called Network Manager, and you have all these nice delegates you can override for messages. But then it turns into a message handling, message passing. You register your handles for when these messages come in, and you can shape your traffic. They've tried to put together, and it's almost there. It needs some more work of doing network transforms, of just having like a network transform class. The problem, it's got a couple of problems. The first one is that the send rate is awful. You can bump it up to like 29 to 30 cents per second, but they are not compressing any of the quaternions, so it's just bulky traffic. And it just turns out kind of choppy. And then also, it's only the top level transform. So if you have a nice, something really cool, like a 6 or 7 hinge or 8 boned hinging kind of animation, and you're trying to pass that across the network, only the top level transform is going to go. They have this thing called network child transform. It doesn't work yet. So it's still growing, it's new. They have, if you're going to do, they got rid of their whole master server, which was a way to do matchmaking. So that's now been deprecated. They have this new, this is where John Riccatello, who's my business advisor, I've known him for years, this is where Unity's going to make their money. They have this new cloud matchmaking service that they're using, and they're letting everyone have it for free right now with 100 concurrent users. It's also still kind of early, and here's a fun fact. There is a hidden undocumented bandwidth delimiter. So if you start spamming traffic, they will just kill all your clients. And it's right now 2 kilobits per second per client is all you can pass. So if you write like a nice robust solution, make sure you compress your traffic. But yes, I highly recommend looking into it, playing with it. It's only going to get better. And as more people use it and build it, it'll get better, because more and more tickets will open on it.
Oh, that sounds interesting. I may have some more questions for you later on.
I'm sure we're out of time, but one last final thing on that is with Photon, reliable UDP implementation. If you're sending anything of any size, you really need to maybe not want to go down that path.
Yeah.
So guys, I think that's our hour. If there's anything you didn't get to ask, or maybe more stuff you want to know, these guys are really approachable. So thanks for coming. I hope everybody got something good out of it, and enjoy the rest of Siege.
Thanks, everybody.